Hey, what's up guys? Kosta here, back for another Patreon game analysis video. This next game and our first batch comes from Nico here playing black. I think this is a Lee Chess classical game. And Nico and his opponent both rated a little bit over 2100 here. And this is actually a really interesting game, and a couple of points could be really instructive for those of you that play the Hedgehog or play the Nimzo Indian slash sometimes go into Hedgehog type of position, specifically where black goes for the Nimzo and then plays for this key move c5. This is of course not the only way to play the Nimzo. There are many different ways of playing the queen c2 Nimzo. Black can castle and play with d5. But c5 has long been considered a pretty solid option. That can actually lead to, I would say, very, very complicated and difficult positions. So here white plays d takes c5. This is actually the typical reaction for white to actually take this pawn, because the queen is no longer on the d file, so white doesn't really have a bunch of support. And if white were to play something tame like e3, number one, black could play d5 here. Black could also take once and play d5 in the future, and leave white with an isolated queen pawn. As c takes d5, black will respond knight takes d5, just recapturing with the piece and kind of leaving white with a weak pawn in the future. So definitely not everyone wants that from white's point of view. And so queen c2 players normally take on c5 and actually play for the structure where white is going to be trying to use the open d file and getting a little bit of a space advantage and putting some pressure against black's position. So here black castles, white goes knight f3, and now bishop takes c5. And so Nico here writes in his notes that he did know that knight a6 is the main move, but he couldn't really understand why. So he played a move that he understands. And let me just say, I think it actually is an interesting case. I do fully support, number one, just playing moves you understand, even if you know that the book move is such and such here, it happens to be knight a6. If it doesn't really make sense to you over the board, I don't think you're really going to enjoy the game and kind of come up with a lot of good ideas. So I would suggest in general, yeah, just kind of follow what your gut instincts tell you when it comes to how to develop your pieces and create your counterplay in the middle game. And then after the game, try to understand, okay, why is knight a6 the right move here? So knight a6 here is simply focusing on the development here for black. After bishop takes c5, black is going to have to spend a couple extra tempi completing the development. With knight a6, black just wants to recapture on c5 with the knight and get the knight very actively placed in the center. And the point here is that on a3, black is going to go ahead and just give up the bishop on c3. It's true we don't exactly double white's pawns, but white had to spend a couple tempi recapturing this one with their queen. And now after knight takes c5, it's considered that black has full compensation for the two bishops, because black gets a ton of lead in development here. You can play d5, you can play b6 and get the bishop quickly to b7, rook comes to c8, and black gets this counterplay on the c file. The knights also have this e4 square, which can be pretty annoying, and basically white is just behind in development, and that's what sort of compensates black for having given up the bishop pair. So this is kind of the idea behind this line. Actually, I think nowadays white doesn't even bother with a3, they just prefer to get their own development going, and after g3 takes and bishop g2, definitely some interesting lines here with knight e4 followed by b6, bishop b7, and so on that you can definitely check out. So these positions are of course very theoretical, very playable for black. In the game, Nico goes for bishop takes c5, bishop g5, and just bishop e7. This move looks a little passive at first, but actually for setting up the hedgehog, it makes a lot of sense. If we're going to play d6 and b6 in this position as black, we actually don't want our bishop stranded on c5, as number one, then white's pin will be extremely annoying. There's like knight e4 ideas here, but secondly, the bishop is just going to get kicked with a3 and b4, and that's just going to be a big problem. So bishop e7, definitely a very correct move for black to start setting up the structure. But then I think Nico makes a really instructive mistake here after e3. He plays knight to c6. Now, at first glance, knight c6, what are we talking about? Looks like perfectly normal move, most natural move in the position, some would say. But when you're playing the hedgehog, as black eventually ends up setting up, he goes a6 here and puts all the pawns on the 6th rank. So this is kind of the hedgehog structure. You put all your pawns on the 6th rank, you cover all the squares on the 5th rank, and it's actually a very solid setup. All the pieces do get reasonable squares. Bishop goes to b7, rook comes to the c file, and then the knights start hopping around on the e5 and c5 squares. And you know, like a hedgehog, which has spikes to kind of protect itself from predators, this setup feels kind of passive, but with all the pawns kind of mobile and flexible, white does have to be pretty careful here not to allow black to just break open and create some counterplay. So this is a opening that really lends itself to counter punches with breaks like b5 and d5 when black can set them up. But the problem for black in the setup is actually that the knight on c6 is not well placed. And I think this is a really important point to understand why about these kinds of positions, because I think they apply to pretty much most hedgehog positions, and you can get a hedgehog structure out of, you know, the English, the Nimzo, you can get it out of the Sicilian, King's Indian, like many different openings can go into a hedgehog formation, and it's really important to understand why exactly the queenside knight does belong on d7 versus c6. And the reason, if we can actually just flip it around and see it from white's point of view, is that if you put your knight on c6 and queen on c7 lined up against white's pieces on the c file, you're going to get hit with knight to d5. So this is a tactic that works in many different positions. Of course, we know this one from the Sicilian. It happens in the open Sicilian very frequently. And yeah, it can basically happen in any position where black has a knight on c6, queen on c7. Even if there was already a rook on c8, black's queen would still be hanging after ed, cd, and white is winning the piece back due to the pin here. And the point is that even though white is not going to be winning any material, once white wins the piece back, white still has a ton of pressure in the position, and black is left with some really weak pawns here, d6 and b6. The hedgehog has just been completely busted, and now black's position just has a bunch of weaknesses to defend. So white would be much better here. So this is something actually both Nico and his opponent miss. Already as early as move 13 here, white could have played knight to d5. And yeah, this move, as long as it's working tactically, is generally going to be very nice for white. You win the piece back, and then the position kind of opens up nicely for white's pieces. And so again, after bishop f4, d6, knight d5 here could have been played. And then after h3, bishop b7, white goes knight a4. This was the last moment where, again, knight d5 would still have been a very decent move for white. So this is, in my opinion, the main reason why the knight on c6 should be going on d7. Number one, of course, the knight on c6 blocks the bishop, but also you're simply running into these knight d5 tactics that are can be very powerful for the opponent. And so if you're playing against the hedgehog and your opponent puts the knight on c6, yeah, make sure to look for that knight d5 shot, because it could be really strong. So this game, I think, continues along, let's say, typical lines. And Nico here plays knight a7. Probably not the best move. When I first saw this one with the idea of pushing b5, I just felt like, well, even if you do get b5, you know, the knight on a7 just feels like a very passive piece. And yeah, lo and behold, a few moves later, black corrects himself here and just puts the knight back on c6. And I think this is right, because even if black is able to get b5 in, the knight on a7 is just going to be very passive, and best case scenario, having to defend a pawn on b5. So black correctly brings a knight back to c6, and it kind of shows you how resilient the hedgehog is here, where black's position, even though he lost tempo or two, is actually still somewhat okay. White continues to maneuver. Now black gets on the right track. Let me just go back earlier and say that instead of knight a7 here, I think the right move for black would have been knight to e5. Coordinating the knights, this knight can now come back to d7 where it belongs. The other knight can jump to d7 to support this knight. And I think maybe a reason that a lot of players typically might shy away from a move like this is because they're worried that white is going to take and double their pawns. But actually, I think this structure would be quite reasonable for black, because these double pawns do control a lot of squares in the center, and I actually think black is not doing that badly here. And actually, black is quite okay. The bishop on the long diagonal is a really nice piece here. So knight e5, I think, was the way to go. Black loses a little bit of time, but eventually gets there. And then I would say Black starts playing this one really, really well. He says on bishop a8, or he writes in his annotations, I have no idea why I played this move. That's funny, because like as far as a hedgehog goes, this kind of move, bishop a8, totally reasonable. It's like you just improve your position by an absolute hair. You wait for white to continue extending and kind of taking space, so you have something to counter attack. And the bishop just gets out of the way of the rook. So now maybe one day Black is more likely to execute one of the typical breaks here, b5. The rook is just kind of opened up for the future, and yeah, just improves the position a little bit. So here white goes bishop f4, and Black throws in bishop to g5, which I think is a really interesting choice. And white goes ahead and takes on g5, which I'm not sure was right, actually. I think white probably should have just backed it up, threatening f4 and forcing Black to retreat as well. But okay, white doesn't want to repeat moves, decides to take on g5 here. But now after h takes g5, I just feel like Black's position starts to look very, very comfortable. Knight on e5 is strong, and this pawn on g5 is doing a very important job of covering the f4 square, not letting white kick the knight with f4. And now it's white's dark squares that one day might become a problem. So here white goes f3, and Black here makes a mistake. I think it's quite instructive and possibly the losing mistake of the game, at least from a practical point of view, by playing this move a5. Now the idea behind the move, I think, is very logical. Black is just fighting for the dark squares. Now that we've traded the dark square bishops, the dark squares are up for grabs, and Black is fighting for them. So the dream would be if white plays b5, then Black gets the c5 square for the queen and for the knight, and that would be positional disaster for white's light squared bishop. But of course, white doesn't play b5, instead plays knight b5, and it uses this square that Black just gave up before his pieces. And now white's not on b5, not just threatening knight a7, which unfortunately ends up missed, but also coming back to d4. Basically, Black has just given up this b5 square without really creating anything, because ab4 is not a threat. White goes ab4, and Black hasn't achieved anything whatsoever. So a5 here ends up being a very critical strategic mistake. Instead, I was thinking natural plan here might be to transfer this knight over to the f4 square, heading towards white's king side. And I think this is something that Black is often trying to do in the hedgehog, just putting a little bit extra pressure on the king side here. Maybe one day Black can follow up with g6, king g7, even bringing a rook to the h-file and looking for a potential king side attack. So that would be kind of my suggestion for this position. It's definitely still not an easy one, but in the game after a5, white is able to take advantage of these weaknesses. Knight b3 is next, rook to d8. I should note, yeah, both white and Black just missed knight a7 here, which would have won, but we'll leave that aside. That's online chess for you. And eventually, I think white ends up playing actually a really nice game, plays queen d2 here, and yeah, Black is not able to hold on to everything now. Almost every pawn hanging in the position. And eventually, game ends when white finds a kind of nice way to deal with the position opening up. So we get some trades. Second knight comes into d4, bishop to d3. And now white starts pushing f4. Black's knight on c8 here, very, very passive. And of course, Black is down a pawn from earlier, so very difficult situation. Black tries to break through here with d5, but white handles this one, I think, very, very nicely. Takes, and queen d3, sidestepping the attack and eyeing the key weakness on h7. Black took on b4, but yeah, this is just leading to mate, and the game is simply over. So again, really interesting game. Thank you, Nico, for submitting this one. I hope the analysis was instructive for everyone watching. And yeah, that's going to wrap it up for this video. The hedgehog is a really interesting structure, but yeah, a lot of nuances and a lot of ways to go wrong for both sides. So it's very complicated and difficult structure to play, but one I think that is ultimately pretty rewarding. So I hope you guys don't get scared off based on this one video. With that, that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll catch you guys next time for more game analysis. Take care.